I'm Shepard. I'm a Christian who's doing a deep dive on Romans, and I wanted you to come along. So let's give you a quick background on what's been going on. First up, Romans is written by Paul, and he's writing to the church in Rome and that he really wants to visit. He wants to share all the spiritual gifts that he has and the ones that they can give him back. He's told them about how he's not ashamed to be a follower of Christ and why they shouldn't be either, and that Jesus' righteousness has been given to us when we believe in him. Today we're looking at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 23. All right, let's get into it. Starting in 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. All right, let's talk about wrath. Wrath is not always what you think it is. Yes, sometimes wrath is what you think of wrath. That probably is wrath. But wrath is not always that. It also is allowing people to have the consequences by the decisions they're making. And it's also not God being petty or emotional or throwing a temper tantrum. Old school preacher John MacArthur says, wrath is the settled, determined response of a holy God against sin. So because God is holy, wrath has to be a part of that. So his holiness goes hand in hand with wrath. In this case, Paul's talking about the fact that we're unrighteous and ungodly, and that is bringing about God's wrath. And because we're unrighteous and ungodly, we're trying to suppress the truth of God. So what truth are we talking about here is the question. So he gets into that in the next verse. Verse 19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. So God has written this moral code on everyone's hearts in the whole world. And he's also given us something called general revelation, which is you can tell God exists by looking at the universe, by looking at the world, by looking at what's around you. Nature itself points to God. It points to God in design, in the existence that we have, in the comprehensibility of understanding the world, and the beauty we see in the world. Everything points to a creator. Staunch atheist C.S. Lewis, who later became a Christian, talked about the fact that everyone should know there's God. He's given proof in nature, and that should lead them to him. Now, he eventually got there, and then once he did that, he had to make the decision, well, which God are we talking about? Which then eventually led him to Jesus. He also wrote this awesome book about that experience called Sobriety by Joy. Going on to verse 20, it says, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So God can be seen moving in the world, although God is invisible. It's kind of like wind. You can't see it, but you can totally know it's happening, especially depending where you live. And since the beginning of time, basically, people have been able to figure out there is a God. That's why there's so many people in history that have pointed towards a God. You can see it in nature and in the beauty all around us. Yet we still love to give excuses about why we don't understand that there's a God, and we can't fathom that there's a God, and can't believe that there's a God. In fact, it's funny because science quite often says there is no God. Scientists will point, but the more and more science gets deeper into itself, you find out a lot of things point to God, such as the Big Bang Theory, which actually points towards there being a beginning to the universe, which means there's a God. Science mainly can only describe what God made. It can't actually tell you if there is a God or not. And then going on in verse 21, it says, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So God shares himself. He quite often shares himself just through nature, but he has shared himself occasionally to direct people, such as Paul and some other guys. And because he is God, he is due our worship. And it's actually to our benefit to worship him. And when we don't worship him, this starts leading to sickly minds. This starts leading to futile thinking compared to healthy thinking. And wrong thinking eventually leads to wrong actions. And this leads to man's inhumanity to man, which has caused all sorts of problems, such as war, violence, abuse, and a whole lot of other things. And this all comes out of our hearts being darkened. Jesus talks about it in Matthew 15:19, where he says, from out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. Our hearts naturally kind of lean to this stuff because we are sinful, which then brings us to how do we fix our hearts? And we fix our hearts by giving them to Jesus. When you put Jesus at the center of your heart, you naturally bow down to him. You naturally give up your will to his will. But in our futile thinking, we quite often are petulant children who will not bow down, even when we know we should. Verse 22 starts saying, claiming to be wise, they became fools. So we often like to trick ourselves. We look at things and go, yeah, that seems about right. We lie to ourselves and say, hey, I'm doing this because it's good, even though we know it's bad. And then we end up playing the fool. And this futile thinking and darkened hearts leads to verse 23, where he says, and exchange the glory of their immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. So, once upon a time in the ancient world, we worshipped idols, calves, statues, logs, whatever. But in modern day, we quite often worship money and sex and entertainment. Now, funny enough, the Avengers got this right. Loki, in the first Avengers movie, talks about the fact that human beings were made to worship. We were made to bow down. And he's not actually wrong. He wanted us to bow down to him, but he's not wrong. We are made to worship. We are made to bow down. But it's supposed to be to Jesus. It's supposed to be to the Father. He is supposed to be on the throne of our heart. And when you exchange Jesus from the throne of your heart for something else, be it money, power, sex, you name it, it leads to bad things. Let's do the super quick recap. God has righteous anger and wrath because we've been suppressing the truth that he wrote his law on our heart, and our hearts and minds are becoming futile because we're refusing to worship him and put him at the center of that and worshiping the wrong things. Well, that's it for this day. We've only just begun. Man, is there so much to Romans. This is just 6 short verses. Next time we're getting into what happens because we've put other things above God. Thanks for watching. God bless.